Hey guys, Bematt here. Today I will be doing a post-commentary in contrast to some of the lax live commentary stuff I've been doing recently. The reason is that I want to talk about a key part about TF2, and that is the maps. Rather, it's not just the maps, but map design in TF2 as a whole. If not obvious enough, the maps designed for TF2 serve as the entire basis for the playing field that the classes and gameplay can adapt to. As a result, the way maps are designed can affect gameplay quite directly, both positively and negatively. In a way, TF2 map design appeals to two spectrums: a stylistic standpoint where the map should look, feel, and play in an appeasing way, and a substantial standpoint where the map adapts to the game mode, gameplay, and interactivity pertaining to the match itself. Good TF2 maps have a balance of style and substance, so to speak, but many also succumb to the problem of doing too much of one or the other, or neither at all. Today I'm going to talk about maps that fail in this balance, how I think they can be improved in the long run, and why I think this balance is so important. You know, sometimes it's not an entire map that has design issues though, it's rather a section of it. There are a lot of good examples for this. I talked about Gorge in my attack defense video about its last point, but I think definitely a more obvious example would probably be Mountain Lab. Mountain Lab is a very nice looking design, and it is really appealing to the eyes. It's spacious, makes interesting use of displacements in buildings to provide flank and movement options. The first capture point takes a bit long. They could cut down on the capture times a little bit, but those are really minor issues. I think the real issue starts in Mountain Lab's final point. I talked about choke points in a lot of my attack defense video, and the way they compensate for a lack of back and forth gameplay, and that can both help or detriment the way a match goes as a whole. Mountain Labs is a disaster. The second point is alright, and the map gives you a lot of nice flank options again going into the final point, but the real issue lies in the design of the point itself. The layers are a nice touch, but ultimately are just flair, because when you get down to it, defense is given a real upper hand here, with a giant open room, with plenty of places to provide defense, with sentries and projectile classes and anything, any pressure, and the ability to take control of all these flanks is very, very simple. This isn't a huge issue, but when you consider the capture point itself, there's a lot to talk about. Sometimes the space in which you must inhabit to point to actually start a capture can make all the difference. This point can only be captured if you stand on the base prop of itself, the point, because there's no space around it to stand in. There's a point you stand on, and then there's just an insta-kill pit right below the point. There's very little space to stand on. And projectile classes, pyros, and anything that can push a class can launch you right into that pit, whether you're Ubered or you're buffed or whatever. They can just throw you right in and you're instantly dead. Not only does this stagnate gameplay, it's just a ridiculous halt in any momentum. The pit is stylistic simply, but there's very little room to take the point in already. You're right in front of defense's spawn, which doesn't give you a lot of room to defend yourself since the spawn can come out and flood you from capping. And there's not a lot of distance between you and that spawn. You're already in danger. You have very little cap room, and there's a pit below you. And it's just very tedious to actually get in and make a capture without being obliterated right off the bat. Getting through turtling or a very tight-knit, strong defense in this point is hard enough, but with the spawn being so close and the capture area so small, you're left struggling to even make an attempt, which stalls the gameplay entirely. Mountain Lab is a very nice looking map, but this final point just inhibits gameplay more than anything. A map like Nucleus, for example, is just a giant ring around a giant instant kill pit. But it has ways to recover if you ever find yourself falling to your demise. The cap area is much bigger too, even being that small. I mean, fundamentally, Nucleus is a different map, but if you're going to put an instant kill pit in your map, there just needs to be a more plausible way to recover. I know the pit on Mountain Lab isn't giant, but it's still very easy to find yourself just seamlessly falling into the pit and dying as a be-all end-all. Now, going from a section to an entire map's design that I think has a giant glaring issue, I have to bring up Junction as my next example. Junction looks pretty nice. It has an interesting design. It's very much like a smaller, inside-only gravel pit. When I first saw Junction, I thought the design of the map and the way it was built was very appealing. It wasn't long after the gameplay started that I realized that Junction's biggest flaw is the same problem I have with early TF2 maps like Dust Bowl and Gold Rush, and that's space. Spatial awareness. Space is important. You can't have too much of it, and you can't have too little of it, but you have to have big and little spaces to make confrontation varied in each room you go in. The problem with Junction is that it's all little spaces. Point A is virtually impossible to defend unless the team you're up against is entirely incompetent, due to the fact that not only is the basic ground space of the room incredibly limited, but the cap point itself is just an elevated square with barely any room to move. You could argue that this would make it easier for defense to crowd control, but you'd be surprised with how much harder it is when there's no way to make any more space for yourself to fight the offense, or it is for them to fight you. But you have the push advantage most of the time, so you find yourself against the odds. Plus, there are only two real fast ways to defend A, one of which puts you on the lower ground and funnels you to a point full of people, and another that's on the same height but is still pretty narrow and annoying to get around. B, on the other hand, is a lot more plausible, which seems unfair when you contemplate the design choices. If I go back to Gravel Pit, B seems to be a favorite for most defense teams, but A is just as easy to defend. They definitely have equal grounds with defense, but on Junction, there's none of that. There's no, like, breathing room. A is a waste of time to defend, and with B's clear advantages, it isn't even much better. When you get to point C on Junction, everything changes. Imagine Gravel Pit C, but even more insurmountable. Honestly, C on Gravel Pit, despite its tower structure and defense advantage, offense can snatch that right out of the defense's hands. On Junction, you can rarely ever say the same. First off, the elevation is even steeper due to the lack of space. The capture space, lo and behold, is small as hell. A demo can obliterate you, get a soldier above you and you're doomed. You're practically stuck in a cube. A pyro can come in and incinerate an entire team. Ironically enough, you could do the same to keep defense out, but that's even if you can get to the point. If there are enough engineers on all the flanks of C, you might never able to get that far. C is horribly accommodating to the defense. Since there are only flanks entering the bottom part of the point, you have to fight a tedious uphill battle. If there are sentries, finding a good place to take them out without having Uber is difficult, and if there are too many sentries, it's almost impossible to take them all out in time. There's no room to breathe. Ultimately, you get stuck in another match, stopped in its tracks. When you think it's too easy to blast through the offensive, it switches around. Junction's last point could use more flanks, but the problem is that the way the map placement is, it's hard to see how they'd be able to afford the space to allow for that. I'm not sure what to say for Junction's sake. It just needs to be bigger, but that defeats the point of the map itself. Ultimately, what is there to say other than the map's concept is just nice on paper, but not quite in practice? Now, these two prior examples were problems with the map design as a component, but there's a rare example where the map's design is excellent, but the game mode itself is flawed, and that's CP Standin. Standin is a map that tries to be separating itself from other non-attack defense capture point maps, and that's through its gameplay. It's not too much of a stretch to compare Standin to Call of Duty's Domination, minus the point threshold you must reach that's required to win in a match. In Standin, a team must capture all 3 points at once to win the game, which sounds like a roundabout King of the Hill type scenario. Now, the way this sounds, it's very cool, and in fact, the map itself is very well designed. It looks very good aesthetically, but above all else, each point is well varied in its terrain and flank potential that it gives you a different challenge to take over each point. There's a lot of room to breathe, and many ways to get around the map, which gives it a nice open feeling to the point where there isn't a lot of funneling. Really, I wouldn't have any problems with this map if it weren't for the fact that Standin doesn't run on overtime. In design, I'll assume the map designers were afraid of being too stalemate-y friendly. You know, with the map, so when a team captures all 3 points and owns them, regardless of any other team contesting any point, the team with all 3 point ownership wins. This is a problem, because rolling on Standin is far too easy. There's nothing stopping teams from easily outclassing a team because they can cap faster, and it gives little room to contest in other ways than direct conflict with the team about to get the winning capture. I've had good game scenarios in Standin where the game went on for a good amount of time, but not without seemingly gimmicky ways of trying to prevent a fast win. This map just goes by too fast, and games never have time to flesh out because it's too easy to steal a win in a matter of minutes. You would barely have time enough to set up a defense. Standin needs the ability to contest via capture. Without it, the games are too flimsy. I'd rather a game be prolonged than cut down to short round bursts. It makes it feel too rolly, and there's not enough room to really develop conflict within the match. It's just really unfortunate considering how nice I think the map looks and feels to play on as a whole. Now finally, I'd like to talk about a map that is maybe my least favorite map in the entire game. Maps should look good and play good as equally as possible to make the most of a map's significance in the player's mind. That's what, in my opinion, makes maps like Gravel Pit, Badwater, and Granary so notable and respected by the player base. Now take a map that's not only dull to look at aesthetically for a long time, but is bulky, too open, and needlessly obstructing and annoying to play on, and that's Egypt. I didn't like Egypt when it came out during the Scout update, and that was a long time ago. Nothing has really changed on that front. Egypt's only benefit is in a unique amount of vertical space for explosive classes to make headway, but in a way I feel like that is just part of a bigger problem. Egypt is too open and bulky, there's too much space that has no significance, and even if you want to call it a flank, it really is just another long way around. There's too many props or brushes that just completely stylistically obstruct gameplay, or make it more tedious to get around. Many of Egypt's main areas are just a bunch of ledges and a lot of jarring open space. Egypt starts out alright, but once you get to the second area and get to this huge needlessly vertical stretch, like an incredibly dull desert tower ascension, it's hard for me to find things about this map I think are beneficial. There are so many health pickups stuck in these hole-in-the-wall areas that you can get ambushed in easily. There are a few interesting aspects, like the hole you can jump through from spawn on Egypt's third stage as the offense, but very few and far between. There are flanks that are just really long ways to get to the top of areas because the normal way is just a lot more annoying to deal with. Plus, Egypt is a map that highly favors one team over the other, and there's rarely a good game that comes out of it. There's no middle ground. All the pointless space and ledges and just inconsequential map design that just completely puts things on an extreme spectrum of one or the other. Plus, after a while, looking at the dull desert brown sepia Egyptian hieroglyphic texture pack, it just gets really dull. And you wish there was a bit more color. You know, I know stylistically this doesn't make any sense, but it just lost its luster very early on and it becomes an eyesore. Egypt is just a disaster. I see what the point of the map design is, but I don't see where the execution makes any sense. It's unfortunate, and I don't like playing on this map at all, honestly. If anything, it's a great standard to base my argument off of. A map where the entire aesthetic is its own detriment, like Junction, but even worse. There's just too much space and too much emptiness. It's like they could have done so much more with the space. Well, that's my thoughts on the subject. There are maps that I think could prosper so much greater if they could be improved to enhance this balance, so that playing on this map is a pleasing experience all around. What do you think about these maps? Do you like them? Do you see things about them that I missed? Are there other maps that you think I should have included? Feel free to tell me in the comments if you're interested. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.